How y'all doing? How y'all doing? Welcome back to Matthew Daniels TV. I'm your host, the illustrious Matthew Daniels, the writer, the author, the scribe, and the bookworm. But I'm not just a bookworm, world. I am the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, may your name live on forever, and may your memory, family, never die. Today, sorry about that. I had to get a sip of my coffee. Today I'm not gonna keep y'all long. But I just want to touch on a aspect of um our ancestors' enslavement in America that's not really spoken on often. Uh, I want to talk about the involvement of Africans on the continent of Africa in the American slave trade. I want to touch on briefly the involvement also of Africans actually in America in the involvement of our enslavement. Not many people like to touch on that, and not many people like to bring evidence to that fact to the table. But when we look at all of the documentation that our ancestors left describing how they became enslaved and describing the conditions that they endured while they were enslaved on these shores, one thing that you're going to see come up more often than not is the concept of the African slave catcher and the African slash Negro slave trader here in the Americas. So you guys see the title of this video. We're going to be talking about blood on African hands, African slave catchers, and African traders. So let's get right off into it. Oh yeah, if you haven't already, make sure you click that like button. Leave me a comment. Let me know where you guys are from. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell so you could be notified whenever I go live, and whenever I release a new video, you can be made aware of it. So without any further ado, we're going to get right off into the information. Blood on African hands, the African slave catchers, and African traders. And we're going to be allowing the ancestors to speak. Okay. So first of all, when we talk about African slave catchers, what I want you guys to understand is that when the slave trade was going on, it was not a situation in which you had European powers coming to the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, and invading with their armies. Right? They didn't come to the west coast of Africa, invade with their armies, wage war on various African kingdoms and African nations, beat them on the battlefield, subdue them, and carry off their people in chains. Now, you do have instances where battles did take place. For instance, like in the Congo, the Portuguese was in the Congo trading for several years before they got knee deep in the slave trade. And so there was some battles back and forth, but that it wasn't necessarily the Portuguese against the Congolese. You had infighting amongst the people of the Congo, the Kingdom of Congo, and some of the ones that were fighting were in allegiance with the Portuguese. So where you did have some Portuguese fighting, it was Portuguese and Congolese fighting other Congolese, and some of them were taken off into slavery. So if you didn't have major European powers waging war on African nations to enslave them, exactly how was it taking place? Now, it took place in several different ways, but the way that I want to lay out for you guys today is one aspect of it was you had what's called the African slave catcher. Now, these African slave catchers were individuals who were part of various African tribes, West African, Central African tribes. And what they would do, they would raid villages, right? They would raid villages, capture men, women, and children, transport them to the coast of West Africa, and they would sell them to the Europeans. And some of them, they would just kidnap. They would just kidnap children while their parents were distracted, or they were off doing their daily routine of looking for food, looking for water, doing things to take care of the home. And they would kidnap these children and they would take them to the west coast of Africa to see them sold off. You also had a situation where slavery was an integral part of African society before the European ever showed up. Now, the African form of slavery wasn't the exact same institution that you seen that's known as chattel slavery in the Americas. The specifics of it were quite different, but the fact that you did have slavery in West Africa before the Europeans arrived, it was not hard for the Africans to sell those individuals who were already enslaved to the Europeans, because slavery was already a thing. It was just as opposed to selling these slaves to other Africans like they had been doing for countless centuries, they began to sell these African slaves to the Europeans. So check this out. While Europeans, now I got this from the Library of Congress .gov website. They say that while Europeans owned and operated the slave ships, the work of kidnapping new victims was generally left to West Africans. Bands of slavers would roam the African countryside, preying on villagers who let their guard down. It sometimes took several months to transport captives to the coast, and they often were sold and resold to several new owners along the way. Once they reached the coast, some captives were taken to slave forts or compounds where they waited for a vessel to arrive. Many of these fortresses still stand on the coast of Africa at places like Elmina and Goree Island as ruined monuments to the cruel economy of years past. Once a ship was ready, the Africans were handed over to their new captors, Europeans and Americans, who would take them on their journey to the Americas. And again, this is something that we don't like to talk about often, but a vast majority of our ancestors who came to these shores, they were enslaved just like this. They were captured by African slave catchers. Now, the image that you're seeing on the left, that is slave factories or compounds maintained by traders from 4 European nations on the Gulf of Guinea in what is now Nigeria. So in the West African country that we call Nigeria today, they had factories, compounds, forts. They had areas where the Europeans had set up shop, and where they had set up shop is basically like a area where the African slave catchers, once they went into the heart of Africa, deep into West Africa, deep into Central Africa, and captured our ancestors, they would bring them to the places like you see in the picture on your screen, and they would hold them captive there until a ship would arrive on the coast, a slave trading vessel, and then they would sell our ancestors to the occupants of these ships. All right. Now, one such slave castle or slave fort or building that was used for this particular purpose is one that is known as the Elmina Slave Castle. It's still there to this very day. There are several buildings, forts, castles, things of that nature. There are several of these buildings that are on the west coast of Africa right now today that you can actually still go and see. And as a matter of fact, this one in Ghana is a high tourist attraction. You have tourists coming from all over, a vast majority coming from the Americas, to where they go and look at the conditions that our ancestors were held in while they awaited a slave vessel to approach, where they could be sold to the Europeans and crossed across what we call the Middle Passage. And they even have places at this Amina slave castle. They have a door that is called the door of no return. And it was through that door that the slaves were led from the dungeons through that door to the ship. And it's called the door of no return because once they went out of that door and once they were placed on this ship, they were never seen again. Look, the Elmina Castle, fortified castle in Elmina, Ghana, that is thought to be the oldest surviving European building in Africa south of the Sahara. Built in 1842 by the Portuguese to protect the gold trade, Elmina Castle later became a major center of the transatlantic slave trade. And again, you have several forts and castles like this, not only the ones in Nigeria and not only the ones in Ghana. As you can see here, this is several images that were drawn up around like the 1700s, documenting the various forts and the various castles and the various areas around West Africa where our ancestors were held. And remember, and following with the theme of this particular video, these Europeans, they stayed on the coast in these forts. And it was the African slave catchers who went into the various parts of West Africa and Central Africa to capture them. And they would bring them and chain them up, imprison them inside of these forts while they waited for a new European slave ship to show up where our ancestors could be sold off. Now, you even have descendants in Africa today, descendants of these African slave catchers. I got this article online from the BBC, and if you notice, the title says, "My Nigerian Great Grandfather Sold Slaves." So we actually have this history is well known in Western Central Africa. It's well known in Western Central Africa. You had some tribes who were more involved in the slave trade than others, and you have some areas who were more involved in the slave trade than others. There's even a good movie called the Warrior. What is it called? The Warrior Queen, something like that, where they're talking about the Dahomey tribe. And they're saying how the Dahomey tribe and another tribe, they were highly involved in capturing slaves for the Europeans. That type of history is actually true. But look at what this Nigerian journalist says about her great grandfather telling the truth about these African slave catchers. She says, "My great grandfather, Mwambani Ogogo Oriaku, was what I prefer to call a businessman from the Igbo ethnic group of southeastern Nigeria. He dealt in a number of goods, including tobacco and palm produce. He also sold human beings. He had agents who captured slaves from different places and brought them to him," my father told me. Mbwana Umwabani Ogogo slaves were sold through the ports of Calabar and Bani in the south of what is today known as Nigeria. So the area that we're calling Nigeria today was highly involved in the slave trade. So much so where you have the descendants of these African slave catchers with this oral tradition being passed down to them. And as you can see, this particular Nigerian journalist, she wants to call her grandfather a businessman instead of a slave catcher. But that's just a matter of perspective, because her grandfather changed the trajectory of the lives of countless countless other Africans. And indeed, many of us would not be here in the Americas today if it wasn't for people like her great grandfather. And so you can see from what her father told her, her grandfather, who was a slave trader in Africa, he would send off bands of men to go deep into West and Central Africa, capture our ancestors, the ancestors of the individuals that was enslaved in the Americas. They would bring them to the slave forts. They would bring them to the European castles and forts that were built on the soil of West Africa, and they would sell them off. And this happened more than people are willing to admit. Now, look, check this out. There are certain proverbs amongst the Igbo people of Nigeria, and these proverbs gives us a glimpse into how the Igbo actually view slavery. Some of these proverbs are anyone who has no slave is his own slave. Another one is a slave who looks on while a fellow slave is tied up and thrown into the grave with his master should realize that the same thing could be done to him someday. Now, this is interesting because, hold on. Sandra Askew in the chat says, "Good morning, Ampu, the real bookworm. Thank you for sharing this with us. Have a wonderful Wednesday. Great subject." Hey, thank you. Thank you for tapping in, Queen. I've been a little under the weather for the past few days. That's why I haven't really been on here to share anything with you guys. But this was a PowerPoint that I was working on. So I finally got it together, and I was like, man, you know what? Let me go ahead on and put this out there on the platform, share this information with the people before I go to work. So thank you for tapping in. I really do appreciate it. It's always good to see you in the chat. But check this out. What we see from this one particular quote is that not only was slavery already a thing in Africa before the Europeans arrived, it was a practice amongst the Igbo that when an individual who owned slaves died, they would sometimes bury his slaves, bury them alive, bury his slaves with him in the grave. Now, imagine that caring so little for the life of the individual that you have enslaved. When you pass away, you have them buried with you, alive, tied up and buried alive with you so that they could continue to serve you even in the afterlife, right? And a third proverb says, "It is when the son is being given advice that the slave learns." I really can't break that one down too much, but as you can see, the concept of slaves and slavery was well known to the Igbo before the Europeans even arrived. So it made it a little easier for them when the Europeans did arrive to capture and sell slaves to the Europeans, because slavery was already ingrained in their society. Now, what I want to show you guys here is the crazy part about it is at some point in history, a good majority of the Europeans realized and accepted that the transatlantic slave trade was inhumane, and they realized and accepted that the act of enslaving another human being and treating them how they were being treated in the Americas and in other places, they realized that they needed to end this particular practice. Now, when the Europeans, certain Europeans, not all of them, when the Europeans had decided to end slavery, right, there were actually kingdoms and kings in West Africa who were outright refusing to end the slave trade. They did not want slavery to end. Why? Because they were being made rich. Certain individuals were being made rich off of the flesh of their fellow Africans. And this just goes to show the mind state that the Africans had in Western Central Africa, even today, really, but even back in those times where they did not see each other as one big African people on the continent of Africa. No, they seen you as you and me as me, so to speak. And so it wasn't as if they felt like they were selling off their brothers and sisters. No, they were selling off these various tribes. The king of Bono, the king of Bani, I apologize, which is now in Nigeria. So here we are in Nigeria again. Allegedly became dissatisfied of the British intervention in stopping the trade of slaves. He says, "We think this trade must go on. That is the verdict of our oracle and the priest. They say that your country, however great, can never stop a trade ordained by God Himself." So I want y'all to think about that psychology. In Britain, Great Britain, they had made the decision to end slavery. And one of the people that they were doing business with is the king of Bani, which is now in modern day Nigeria. And so the king of Bani said that he felt that the slave trade must go on. And not only that, he said that it was sanctioned by the oracle and the priest and ordained by God Himself. So even when you can look into the mind state of some of these African slave catchers and of some of these kingdoms and of some of these tribes who indulge in the catching of their fellow Africans and selling them to the Europeans to be brought brought to the Americas and subjected to chattel slavery. Some of these guys said that it was ordained by God that our ancestors be enslaved. And when they consulted their oracles and priests, the religious men of their nations, of their tribes, of their states, it was the verdict of their oracles and priests speaking on behalf of their particular African god that said that our ancestors must be enslaved. And this process must continue to go on. As sickening as that is, I think as Americans who are descendants of slavery, right? Descendants of the horrors that our ancestors endured here in America, we need to really understand that the Africans, they were not, they were complicit. Let me just put it like that. They were complicit in what happened to us, and had they not been working hand in hand with the Europeans, it never would have happened. A lot of us we were captured by these African slave catchers and African slave traders, and we were sold to the Europeans on African soil. And the crazy thing about it is you actually have the records of several of our ancestors who were enslaved here in America who tell us their firsthand stories of being captured by these African slave catchers. Is not just it, that's not like a mythological concept that is being created today to alleviate the responsibility of the European. No, the European definitely needs to be held accountable for what they did. But in this video, we're highlighting what the Africans did. We're not gonna let them escape. And so we have a man named Oleado Equiano. Now, he was enslaved in the 1700s inside of the Americas, and through various exploits that he described in his book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oluwadu Equiano, he explains to us that he himself and his sister as children were captured by some of these African slave catchers. And so we get a firsthand account of individuals that were captured like this. So we know that it's a reality. It's not a myth. Now, Oleado, he was abducted at around like 8 years old. And in his book, he tells us One day, when all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, two men and a woman got over our walls and, in a moment, seized us both. And without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could till night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep. So we see a first-hand account of Oluwadu Equiano saying that when he was a small child, him and his sister were left playing alone, and some wicked African slave catchers kidnapped them. Ran off with them into the night, bound, covered up their mouths so they couldn't call for help. And this man ended up being enslaved in the Americas. First-hand account of someone being captured by African slave catchers. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't make mention of the fact that slavery in Africa, it was indeed different than slavery in the Americas. Okay. So, although there was slavery going on in Africa before the Europeans showed up, the slaves in Africa weren't necessarily treated how they were treated here in the Americas. And so, just for the sake of being transparent and honest about the information, I would also like to share with you guys this passage that Oluwadu Equiano placed inside of his book as well. He says, "Those prisoners which were not sold or redeemed we kept as slaves, but how different was their condition from that of the slaves in the West Indies." So you see, he's in a unique position to where he could speak to slavery in Africa because he was from Africa, and he could speak to the slavery in the Americas. So he goes on to say, "With us, they do no more work than other members of the community, even their master. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly the same as theirs, except that they were not permitted to eat with those who were free-born, and there was scarce any other difference between them than a superior degree of importance which the head of a family possesses in our state, and that authority which, as such, he exercises over every part of his household. Some of these slaves have even slaves under them as their own property and for their own use." So you see here that some slaves actually owned other slaves under them, which was that would pretty much be unheard of in the Americas. And it's interesting to note that Oluwadu Equiano, he was an Igbo as well. The same Igbo that I quoted those proverbs from earlier, the Igbo people of Nigeria. Like I say, that Nigeria, man, the area that we call Nigeria today, heavily involved in the slave trade back in the day. So moving on from him, there are other attestations of African slave catchers that I would like to go to. In the Oklahoma slave narratives, we have a man named Andrew Sims who describes that his mother and his father were captured by Negro slave hunters in Africa, further lending credibility to the idea that Negro slave catchers were a real thing and a real serious problem. Look, he says, "My parents come over on a slave ship from Africa about 20 years before I was born, on the William Driver plantation down in Florida. My folks didn't know each other in Africa, but my old mammy told me she was captured by Negro slave hunters over there and brought to some coast town where the white buyers took her and carried her to America. You see the exact same story. This man's mother was captured by Negro slave hunters, took to the coast, locked in one of those forts, and basically waited there for a European vessel to show up, or European slave trading vessel to show up. She was sold to the Europeans, and they carried her to America. Andrew Sims goes on to say she was kinder a young gal then, and was sold to some white folks when the boat landed here. Dunno who they was. The same thing happened to my pappy. So her mother and her father were captured. I'm sorry, his mother and his father were captured in Africa by Negro slave hunters and carried to a coastal town where they were locked up and imprisoned until a European slave trading vessel showed up, and then they were sold and brought to America. Now, the interesting thing about this is this individual was born in 1857, right? And he says that his parents come over on a slave ship from Africa about 20 years before he was born. So that would take us to around 1837. Now, the interesting part about that is at one point it became illegal to transport Africans from the continent of Africa to the Americas for the purpose of enslavement. But when you look into the historical record, you find out that slavery and the quote unquote slave trade went on long after it was illegal. And so what we see here, if you look at the dates, is you see that if this guy's parents were captured by Negro slave hunters in 1837 and sold to white buyers who brought them to America, then what we're also seeing right here in this story is we're seeing Africans as well as Europeans involved in the slave trade even after it had become illegal. Remember, I told you guys that even when certain Europeans were trying to end they were trying to bring about an end to slavery, or at least the importation. They were trying to bring about the end of the importation of Africans directly from Africa to be enslaved in the Americas. You had the Negro slave hunters, you had the African slave catchers still fully immersed in what we're calling the slave trade. They were not the ones who forced the trade to stop. They didn't want it to stop by no means. So look at this, family. So what we have here is a document, right? Now this document is the document that made it illegal to transport Africans from the continent of Africa to the Americas, right? And you see that it basically became illegal in around 1808. Now, remember, this guy's parents were captured by Negro slave hunters and brought to the Americas in 1837. So this is around 30 years after it became illegal. Now, just for the sake of sharing information with you guys, I'm going to read a little bit of what this document is about. It says, by the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, only Georgia still participated in the international slave trade, which had been abolished during the Revolution as part of the ban against trade with England. Nonetheless, Southern states were determined to protect the slave trade. A compromise, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, placed a possible time limit on the international trade but did not end it. It stated that Congress could not prohibit the importation of persons prior to 1808. So around the time of the Revolutionary War is when they began to, deal with the idea of ending the transatlantic slave trade, stopping the importation of Africans from Africa to the Americas. right? But obviously they had a lot of opposition. They were dealing with a lot of opposition when they tried to make it illegal to do so. So in order to have some type of a compromise, they didn't make it illegal immediately. They put a time limit on it, and they said, okay, check this out. We want to end the importation of slavery now. We want to end the importation of African slaves to the Americas right now. But for the sake of our opposition, we're going to give you until 1808. Now, after January 1808, this thing is going to be illegal. So get all your affairs in order, get everything out that you need to get out, but we're not going to be able to continue this forever. Look, 20 years later, President Thomas Jefferson, who himself held deeply contradictory beliefs about the morality and legality of slavery, signed this act to prohibit the importation of slaves in any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from and after the first day of January 1808. Jefferson and Congress hoped to settle finally one aspect of the contentious issue of slavery by ending the international slave trade. The act imposed heavy penalties on international traders, but did not end slavery itself or the domestic sale of slaves. Not only did it drive trade underground, but ships caught illegally trading were often brought into the United States and its passengers sold into slavery. So the beginning portions of trying to bring about an end to slavery, the first step was to end the importation of slaves from Africa into the Americas. And so that basically became illegal around January 1808. But again, we see firsthand information that several boatloads of enslaved individuals were brought over to the Americas after this, and a lot of the Africans were still complicit in it. So that's the African slave catchers. Now, not only is there blood on African hands in the form of the African slave catchers, over here in America, you also had Africans who were complicit, or Negroes who were complicit in slavery. You had Negro overseers who worked on behalf of the slave master to beat and keep in line those who were enslaved. And you had Africans or Negro slave traders and plantation owners right here in America. And these particular jobs are things that we don't like to talk about as well. But for this video, we're going to go into that as well. So we see that the African slave catcher was indeed a thing. So now I want to go into the Negro overseer and the Negro slave trader to show that unfortunately our people were never 100% unified in our disgust for the institution of slavery. But first, what is an overseer or a driver, a plantation overseer or a slave driver? Well, overseers were agents employed by Southern slaveholders to supervise the daily affairs on a plantation. These individuals often came from a class of landless young men, some of whom were the sons of well-established slaveholders. Over time, however, a professional class of managers also developed to meet the needs of the ever-expanding plantation economy of the South during the antebellum era. An overseer's duties on the farm were manifold. Their primary task was to ensure the timely production of cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugarcane. Because these were such labor-intensive crops, an overseer was also responsible for directing the activities and living conditions of slaves, who were the backbone of the region's workforce. So when we're talking about an overseer, for those of you that don't know, you would have a slave owner, right? Now this guy may own 2,000 acres of land, and he may own anywhere from like 75 to 200 slaves. Okay. Now, the day to day operations of the plantation, actually monitoring the slaves in the field, actually carrying out the punishments, actually searching for the runaways. The plantation owner didn't do this. You have to look at the plantation owner like the CEO of a McDonald's, of a multi-million dollar corporation. These guys had money. They had money, they had land, they had power, they had influence. They weren't getting their hands dirty like that. They paid people to do it for them. It's like if you have a CEO of McDonald's, right, or you have an owner of McDonald's and they own like 3 different McDonald's somewhere, they're not the managers who are actually in the store making sure you come to work on time, you clock out on time, you take your break, making sure that you cooking the food properly. They're not there doing that. They pay a manager to do that for them. So the plantation overseer was kind of like the manager. They managed the plantation on behalf of the plantation owner, right? And so a lot of times this job was carried out by what they call poor white trash. Now, I'm not making that up. When you actually read the literature that was written during that time, this is what they called them. Because every white person, although they were better than every black person, every white person wasn't a slave owner. They weren't rich. They weren't well off. Some of them lived just as bad as the slaves, and some of their homes were just as bad as slave quarters. And a lot of them, they were dirty, they were unkept, they were uneducated, they couldn't read, and they were looked down on by the elite, so to speak, of the society. And so a way in which the quote unquote poor white trash could um maneuver from being poor and insignificant to being a mover and shaker in the community, they would make money by being an overseer. Like, have you guys ever seen that movie Django with Jamie Foxx? If you think about it, remember in that movie Django with Jamie Foxx, when Django and the dentist, they were with Leonardo DiCaprio, right? And they were traveling in his carriages and stuff, and they were going to his plantation so they could talk about buying a Mandingo slave because they wanted to get into the Mandingo fight game. And as they were traveling, they saw they had in it one of Leonardo DiCaprio's slaves had tried to escape. And so when they pulled up on him, the guy was in a tree, and you had these white guys with dogs barking at him, trying to tell him to come down from the tree and whatnot. And Leonardo DiCaprio was like, quiet down them dogs. I can't hear myself think. And they pulled the dogs away so he could call the dude to come out the tree so he could ask him, like, hey man, I paid $500 for you. I need 5 fights. Now think about that scene. Now the guys that were in charge of the dogs that had ran the runaway slave down, and think about they were dirty, they were unkept, they couldn't speak well, they were the quote unquote poor white trash. They were very uneducated. You understand what I'm saying? And so they were used by the rich guy, Leonardo DiCaprio, to run the plantation. Now, some of those overseers, the quote unquote poor white trash, they would work as an overseer for various plantations. They were paid to do so. They would save up their money. And then in some instances, once they saved up enough money, okay, yeah, you seen Django. Yeah, those were the quote unquote poor white trash. That's why if you ever see a movie like that, when they show the overseers, they always look like that because that's how they look in the historical record. Dirty, unkept, raggedy houses, spitting, slurring, can't really read or write. The only thing that they had going for themselves is they were white, so they were better than the Negro. That's all it was. But anyway, they would save up enough money to where they could probably buy some land or buy some slaves of their own, and then they would try to work their way up into a higher tax bracket. Okay, they would try to work their way up into a higher tax bracket. Even when you look back into those days, those quote unquote poor white trash, they couldn't even vote. In order to vote, like a lot of people talk about how women had to get the right to vote, how African Americans had to get the right to vote. Well, even those the non-land owning whites, they couldn't vote either. In order to vote back in early America, you had to be 1, white, 2, male, 3, landowner. If you weren't a white male landowner, you couldn't even vote. And that's just real. That's just real. And so check this out. And so the thing about it is the overseers, they weren't always white. Imagine that. They weren't always white. Now these overseers, they would beat the slaves. They would enforce punishment on the slaves. They would make sure that the people that was enslaved turned out for work in the morning at the time that they were supposed to turn out for work. If they tried to escape, they would run them down, punish them for that. Okay, but what you got to understand is the overseers, they were not even always white. A lot of times, the slave masters would use Negro overseers to beat, right, the Negro slaves. And even sometimes you had plantation overseers who were white, but they were working in tandem with Negro overseers. They were all working hand in hand. And so to validate this point, what I want to take you guys to next is this is a slave narrative out of Georgia. The ancestor Sarah Gray, who actually in her narrative, she mentions this quote unquote Negro slave overseers, just to show you guys that this is an actual thing. Look, she says the Nesbits, according to Sarah, followed the customary practice of the other slave owners in the matter of the punishment of slaves. She says, however, that while there were stories of some very cruel masters, in her opinion, the slave owners of those days were not as cruel as some people today. She said occasionally slave owners appointed some of the slaves as overseers. And very often these slave overseers were very cruel. So these Negro overseers or these slave overseers, these aren't free black people. What they would do is they would get black people that were already enslaved. And then what the slave owner would do is they would be like, okay, I'm going to make you the overseer over the rest of these Negroes. And when you look into the historical record, you find out that a lot of times these slave overseers or the Negro overseers were more cruel than the slave owners themselves. And they were more cruel than some of the white overseers. And when I think about that in my mind, it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not that type of individual, but I would imagine that in the mind of the slave overseer, they felt that they had some type of elevated status over the rest of the slaves. And in order to, make the slave owner happy, they felt as if they had to be extra cruel, extremely cruel. They had to show that they just don't play. Going back to my Django reference, remember in the movie, the dentist told Django to pretend to be a black slaver, a black slave owner. And Django was like, man, you know what? That's like the lowest of the low, man. That's the lowest of the low. And that was the lowest of the low, because here it is, you're enslaved just like we're enslaved. But to make the slave master happy, you're gonna treat us worse than how the white folk treat us. And so the slave overseer was a very, very hated class. But we even see again the complicitness of the Africans in our enslavement from Africa all the way over here to the Americas, every step of the way. Now look, check this out. Not only did how can I put this? Not only did the quote unquote poor white trash get rich off being an overseer, sometimes, this didn't happen often, but sometimes the Negro overseers could get rich as well if the slave owner was willing to pay them for their work. Now, we have here this is from the Arkansas slave narratives. We have one of the ancestors named Miss Irene Robertson. Now, the interesting thing about this slave narrative is that she says that her grandfather was one of these one of these Negro overseers, and her grandfather was able to get rich off of so I can blow this up a little bit. Her grandpa was able to get rich off of it. So look, she says, let me see. Okay. He had, when speaking about her slave owner, she says he had 200 or 300 slaves. He was a good man. He was a good master. He had some white overseers and some black overseers. Grandpa Peter was one of his overseers. He was proud of his slaves. He was a proud man. We all had preaching clothes to wear. He had his slaves be somebody when they got out of the field. They went in washing at the fish pond, duck pond too. It was clear and sandy bottom. Wouldn't be muddy when a lot of them got through washing and bathing. They was black, but they didn't stink sweaty. They wore, well, we're gonna skip on down. Look, she says, they had 12 children. Last letter mama had from them. I've never seen any one of them. Let's look at this last paragraph. He says, Grandpa Peter was a overseer. After he was made overseer, he was paid. That was an honor for being good all his life. When freedom come on, he had $10,000. He was pure African, black as ace of spades. So in this one particular slave narrative, we see a couple of things. We see, again, the illegal slave trade is still going on because her grandfather Peter was a pure African. He was brought directly over from Africa after it had become illegal in 1808 to transport Africans to the Americas for the purpose of slavery. And so this African, since he was good all his life, working for the slave master, he was made into one of these Negro overseers. And so by the time freedom came, and what she mean by that is the Civil War. By the time the Civil War came, he had saved up around $10,000, which he subsequently used to buy land and buy houses. And she goes on to mention some other stuff that he did with his money. But you can tell that if a Negro who is enslaved, but since he is in such good standing with the slave owner, he is being paid to be a Negro overseer, and he could save up $10,000. And you can just imagine what the white overseers were being paid. And this goes back to when I told you guys that a lot of the overseers, they would try to use working as an overseer to save up money to buy land, property, and to buy slaves themselves so that they could raise up in society, or elevate in society, put themselves into a new tax bracket. So if these Negroes were actually paid, then they were actually able to be paid really well. And so you can see it's the trade off, right? It's the trade off because yes, if you're a Negro overseer, if you're a slave overseer, you have to be in charge of punishing, right? Punishing the other slaves, punishing the other Negroes, but for the perks, they were willing to do it. For the perks, they were willing to do it. They were willing to sell out those who were enslaved with them for a few extra trinkets, a little bit of money, extra food, extra privileges, or to be seen in a good light by the slave owner. So it's not a new thing, what we call sellouts, or an individual being willing to sell out those who are in the same predicament as them, those who have the same background as them, those who have the same hardships and same beginning status as them, for a few crumbs. Somebody come along and be like, "Hey man, I'll give you $1,000. I'll give you $2,000. I'll give you $3,000 to throw them guys over there under the bus." They gonna throw them under the bus. It's been happening since the beginning of time, and it's going to continue. It's going to continue to happen. You dangle that carrot in front of an individual face, they are going to plow the entire field, right? They're going to plow the entire field. And so when we're talking about the African slave catchers, when we're talking about the Negro overseer or the slave overseer, we also want to look at the fact that when punishments were meted out, right, a lot of times they used the Negroes, they used the black people, they used the slaves to inflict the punishment on the other slaves. And to highlight this, we have another ancestor who gives us a first-hand account of this, and this is ancestor Mary Gladdy, excuse me, from the Georgia slave narrative. And let's look at the story that she goes on to tell us. So she says, "My father was a very large, powerful man. During his master's absence in 63 or 64, a colored foreman on the Heinz Holt place once undertook to whip him, but my father wouldn't allow him to do it. This foreman then went off and got 5 big buck Negroes to help him whip father, but all 6 of them couldn't outman my daddy. Then this foreman shot my daddy with a shotgun, inflicting wounds from which he never fully recovered." So you see, this foreman is an overseer, right? And so based on something that her father did, the overseer tried to punish him, whoop him. And this was a big guy, just wasn't feeling it that day. And it's like, man, you're not finna whoop me. I'm not finna let you tie me to no tree. I'm not finna let you tie me to no barrel. You not touching me, man. You're not touching me. And so the foreman, or the overseer, being a weak individual, he couldn't forcefully whip him. So what did he do? He went off and got what the ancestor calls 5 big buck Negroes to help him whip her father. And these 5 big buck Negroes came to help, because this was kind of just the order of the day. They came and instead of saying, I'm a slave just like him, why would I help you whoop him? Why would I help you beat him? No, in order to curry some type of a favor with this foreman or this overseer, these 5 big buck Negroes came to help try to whoop her daddy, right? Sell out. But all 6 of them couldn't do it. So the foreman just got his shotgun and shot the dude. Was like, "Hey man, if we can't whoop you, I'm gonna just put you down." And look, so the ancestor goes on to say, in 65, another Negro foreman, now a Negro foreman, again, Negro overseer. In 65, another Negro foreman whipped one of my little brothers. This foreman was named Warren. His whipping my brother made me mad. And when a few days later I saw some men on horseback whom I took to be Yankees, I ran to them and told them about Warren, a common Negro slave, whipping my brother. And so this happened when the Civil War was hot. You had a Negro foreman or a Negro overseer who the ancestor points out was a common Negro slave just trying to curry favor with the white folk, whipped her little brother. And now this this sellout, his name was Warren, whipped her little brother. And so you see that she came when the Yankee army came and invaded the South. She told the soldiers about this Warren, and how he had been trying to curry favor with the white folk by whooping on her little brother. This guy Warren, he ran off to hide. He ran off to hide. He was real tough with our little brother. But when the Yankee soldiers came and they was looking for him because he whooped our little brother, this dude was nowhere to be found. He ran off and he hid. But this just goes to show that, again, the blood on the African hands all the way from Africa to the plantation is really undeniable. And so not only did you have African slave catchers, not only did you have Negro overseers, not only did you have Negroes who inflicted punishment, physical punishment on the other individuals that was enslaved, you also had what's known as the Negro slave trader. You had Negroes, black people who owned slaves. They weren't slaves themselves who were overseers on a plantation. They were free Negroes. They were free. And they owned slaves. And not only did they own slaves, they sold them as well. 100% complicit in the slave trade. So, look, check this out. We have another attestation that I found in the slave narrative, which mentions one of these quote unquote Negro slave traders. Look what the ancestor says. Master Harris sold Mother and Grandma. Mother said she was fat, tall, strong-looking gal. Master Harris let a Negro trader have Grandma, Mother, and her 3 brothers. They left Grandpa. Master Harris told the nigger traders not divide Grandma from her children. He didn't believe in that. He was letting them go from their father. That was enough sorrow for them to bear. They was in Alabama. They was auctioned off. Master Harris lived in Georgia. The auctioneer held Mother's arms up, turned her all around, made her kick, run, jump about to see how nimble and quick she was. He said, "This old woman can cook. She has been a good worker in the field. She's a good cook." They sold her off cheap. Mother brought a big price. They caught on to that. The man nor woman wasn't good to them. I forgot their names, what bought them. The nigger traders run her 3 brothers on to Mississippi. The youngest one died in Mississippi. They never seen the other 2 or heard of them till after freedom. They went back to Georgia. All of them went back to their old home place. So what do we see from here? Exactly, this happened to... Yep, no doubt. It definitely did happen to Frederick Douglass. I see you been doing your reading and your studying, Sandra. I ask you, I like that. So look, what do we get? What information can we glean from this particular slave narrative? One, which is the most important thing, is that there were Negro slave traders, free Negroes who were dealing in the business of selling African flesh, right? No different than the African slave catchers over there in Africa. They were doing it here too. And so you see that this particular woman's owner, right, gave her grandmother, her mother, and her three brothers to a Negro slave trader and told him not to divide them up. And what did this individual do? This Negro slave trader auctioned some of them off in Alabama and took the other ones to Mississippi. He divided them up almost immediately. But what we see is the evidence of Negro slave traders. Again, going back, like I say, to the movie Django. You know, Jamie Foxx was playing the role of a Negro trader. Now, this is weird how that actually works, because in some instances you had black people that owned slaves during slavery, but they only owned them because they wanted to give them some semblance of freedom, right? They weren't cruel, they weren't wicked, and some of the people that they owned were their own family members. It was just hard to actually get them their freedom outright. So when one of them got free, they quote unquote owned the other ones, and for all intents and purposes gave them their freedom. They let them live how they wanted to live. But you also had some who were just as bad, if not worse, as the white slave traders and the white slave owners, right? And we have attestations to it right here. And not only do you have attestations to the Negro slave traders right here, you have a direct account of Negro slave traders breaking up families, just like we have with the white slave traders breaking up families. You have individuals that may talk about selling off a child to this plantation, then selling the mother to this plantation, selling the father to this plantation. And we know how cruel and inhumane it is to split up a family. But we also see that some of these Negro slave traders, they split up families as well. Right? They split up families as well. But this individual is not the only account of someone being owned by a Negro slave trader. We actually have a more well-documented account of this in the life of ancestor Anne Marie Weems. Okay, in the life of ancestor Anne Marie Weems. Now, it's a reason why in this picture she appears to be dressed up like a boy, because in order to get freedom, she had to dress up like a boy in order to escape. So, we're going to get off into that. But first, let's just look at who Anna or Anne Marie Weems is. Anne Marie Weems, whose aliases include Ellen Caprone and Joe Wright, was an American woman known for escaping slavery by disguising herself as a mail carriage driver and escaping to British North America, where her family was settled with other slave fugitives. Now, British North America is Canada. She and her younger sister were separated from her family at the age of 7, and her mother and brothers were sold in Alabama. Within a few months, her mother and 2 of her youngest brothers were manumitted and settled with their father in Washington, D.C. Then, freedom for her sister, Catherine, was negotiated. The Weems had attained the money to pay ransoms through abolitionists in England and the United States, but were unable to purchase Anna Marie Weems' freedom. At age 15, she ran away from her slaveholder in Rockville, Maryland, and traveled through Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Brooklyn, New York, before arriving in Dresden, Canada West, British North America. The journey, made more treacherous due to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, occurred over 2 months, 6 weeks of which she was in hiding, and most of which she was dressed as a young man. 3 books have been written about Weems and her family members' struggle for freedom, entitled A Shadow of the Household, Stealing Freedom, and The Underground Railroad, Anna Marie Weems. So we see that this individual was part of a family, and the majority of her family had gotten their freedom. And she was like one of the youngest in the family. And what happened was every attempt to purchase her outright to get her free so that she could, reunite with the rest of her family, were shot down. And they were shot down by the individual that owned her. Now, she was owned by a man named Charles Price. And Charles Price is one of these Negro slave traders. And not only was he a Negro slave trader, he was kind of like a heavyweight in the game. He was a heavyweight in the game, and he bought and sold a lot of African Americans. Like this was his business, and he made a lot of money doing so. And so, for whatever reason, he owned this particular young girl, and every attempt to get her free was shot down. He would not sell her for whatever reason, and he would not allow her to get free. So the question may be asked: How do we know that she was owned by one of these quote unquote Negro slave owners? Well, we have the records. We see that eventually she did get her freedom via the Underground Railroad, and the ancestor William Steele, may his name live on forever and may his memory never die, left us very, very detailed records about the individuals that escaped on the Underground Railroad. And so we actually have multiple letters that were written in direct reference to Anna Marie Weems. So if you look, it says Thanksgiving Day, November 1855. This is when she actually not got her freedom or started on the Underground Railroad, but when she actually arrived. It says arrived Anne Marie Weems, alias Joe Wright, alias Ellen Capron, from Washington through the aid of Dr. H. She is about 15 years of age, bright mulatto, well grown, smart, and good looking. For the last 3 years, or about that length of time, she has been owned by Charles M. Price, a Negro trader of Rockville, Maryland. Mr. P, or Price, was given to intemperance to a very great extent and gross profanity. He buys and sells many slaves in the course of the year. His wife is cross and peevish. She used to take great pleasure in torturing one little slave boy. He was the son of her master. He was the son of his master and was owned by him. This was the chief cause of the mistress's spite. So look, you know how you would have white slave owners that would have sex with the women that they had enslaved and have children by them. And because the mother was enslaved, these children would be enslaved as well. Well, this particular Negro slave trader, Charles M. Price, him as well, had children with some of his slaves. And the children that he had with his slaves were enslaved to him as well. And we have an account of one boy being treated very, very bad by Charles's wife because he was the son of her husband. So this Negro slave trader, he acted in the exact same manner as the white slave owners. And you see how it says that this Charles M. Price, this Negro trader, he buys and sells many slaves in the course of the year. Remember, I told you, he was a big dog. He was a big dog in the slave trade scene. He wasn't no small fish who just owned a slave here and there. He's actually mentioned in this land marker, right? Whenever you have a specific spot that has significant historical relevance, they put like markers up to describe to you why this particular location is of historical significance. Now, in this one, we see that this Charles Price, who owned Anne Weems, is mentioned. Look, they say the Montgomery Courthouse that stood here from 1840 to 1891 witnessed the turbulent antebellum and Civil War years in Rockville. It was the setting for legal transactions involving both the selling and emancipation of enslaved individuals. Charles Price, a slave trader who co-owned the prominent Price, Birch and Company slave trading company in Alexandria, Virginia, held property nearby and placed newspaper advertisements to purchase enslaved Montgomery County residents. Fugitives and those charged with the crime of abating freedom seekers were tried here. So they have a picture of the courthouse where a lot of the slave trading business took place. And we also see that this guy, Charles Price, he was a co-owner of the prominent Price, Birch and Company slave trading company in Alexandria, Virginia. So he was in fact a mover and shaker in the slave trading community. And if you guys can see, they have a article, right? They have an article on this landmark, that white rectangle on the left that says "Cash for Negroes." It says the subscriber wishes to purchase a lot of Negroes of different ages and sizes, for which he will give the highest cash prices. He can always be found at his residence at Unity, Montgomery County, Maryland. Persons having slaves to dispose of will find it to their advantage to call on him or address by letter. Charles M. Price. So this guy was so big on purchasing slaves and selling slaves, he even put out multiple advertisements in the newspapers to this effect. And what we have here is this is the actual building of Price, Birch and Company. You see how it says dealers in slave. Now, this picture was taken after the Civil War, and so you see how you have the Union Army standing in front of the building, effectively having shut it down. So in the Underground Railroad Records by William Steele, when it's talking about the ancestor Ann Weems, who was enslaved to this African slave trader who was a mover and shaker in the slave trading community, you have documented letters that were passed back and forth between the individual who assisted Ann Weems in getting free from this African slave trader, and between William Steele himself. Okay, and so what I want to do now is I'm just going to highlight a few of the things that these letters talked about. So you see on the left, you have William Steele speaking, and he says that it was the business of the Vigilance Committee, as it was clearly understood by the friends of the slave, to assist all needy fugitives who might in any way manage to reach Philadelphia, but for various reasons not to send agents south to incite slaves to run away or to assist them in doing so. What he's basically talking about is they had created something called the Vigilance Committee. And now the Vigilance Committee was abolitionists, both black and white, who did everything in their power to assist slaves get free. When an individual would run away from a plantation in the South and make it to a free state, they would offer them money, support. They would offer them travel to all the way to Canada, so they would not be caught. They would help them escape the slave catchers. If a particular captain on a boat had ferried them from the south to the north, they would pay the fee for them bringing them there. And the Vigilance Committee was basically like just a group of real live superheroes who helped countless of our ancestors get free. And so it was this Vigilance Committee that assisted Ann Weems in getting free. And so look, on the left, you have a letter from J. Bigelow Esquire. Now, J. Bigelow Esquire was a lawyer, and this guy, he was a lawyer. He was a European, a white man, but he was very much anti-slavery. And so it was Jay Bigelow, who brought the situation of Ann Weems to the attention of William Steele, and he worked tirelessly for several years, mind you, several years to try to get her free. If you look, you can see the date on this first letter from Jay Bigelow to William Steele is June 27, 1854. And we know that she wasn't actually arrived free until Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1855. So even while she was enslaved to this Negro slave trader, there were individuals working behind the scenes to try to get her free. A lot of times freedom, and it did not come overnight. But just to give you guys a idea of what some of these letters back and forth look like, I'll just read a few excerpts. So Jay Bigelow says, Mr. W.M. Steele, dear sir, I have to thank you for the prompt answer you had, the kindness to give to my note of 22nd. Having found a correspondence so quick and easy, and withal so very flattering, I address you again more fully. The liberal appropriation for transportation has been made chiefly on account of a female child of 10 or 11 years old, for whose purchase I have been authorized to offer $700, refused, and whose sister I have paid $1,600 and some $1,000 for their mother, etc. This child sleeps in the same apartment with its master and mistress, which adds to the difficulty of removal. She is some 10 or 12 miles from the city, so that really the chief hazard will be in bringing her safely to town and in secreting her until a few days of storm shall have abated. And so what Jay Bigelow is trying to say in reference to Ann Weems, he's already gathered money from the Vigilance Committee. You had people who were willing to pay for individuals to get free. He's already paid to get one of her sisters free. He's already paid to get her mother free. And he was authorized by the other members of the Vigilance Committee to offer $700 to get Ann Weems free, which was refused. This Negro slave trader did not want to let her go for whatever reason. And he said, to make matters worse, when they realized that she may try to get free like other members of her family had gotten free, the Negro slave trader, Charles Price, forced her to sleep on the floor in a corner inside of his bedroom with him and his mistress, kind of like a dog or a cat or a pet, so that she would not try to get sleep, try to get free, rather. When they would go to sleep, they would give her a blanket and make her curl up on the floor and inside of their room. And so the lawyer, Jay Bigelow, is saying that made it even more difficult to try to get her free, right? But nevertheless, he continued to talk back and forth with William Steele, trying to come up with ways that they could get her free. And so, look, on September 9th, 1855, we have records of a second letter from lawyer Bigelow. He says, Mr. W.M. Steele, dear sir, I strongly hope the little matter of business so long pending and about which I have written you so many times will take a move now. I have the promise that the merchandise shall be delivered in this city tonight. Like so many other promises, this also may prove a failure, though I have reason to believe that it will not. So you see that this is the second letter that's documented in the Underground Railroad records, but for whatever reason, William Steele didn't put all of their correspondence into the book, but he was writing back and forth over all of this time. You see, this is over a year later. They were writing back and forth where they continuously tried to get this young lady her freedom, but every time they tried to get her freedom, things would kind of fall through. But thankfully, they didn't give up on her. They didn't give up on her. They didn't give up on the idea of getting her free. What I want to show you guys real quick is that also when the Vigilance Committee were doing what they had to do to try to get our ancestors free, a lot of times this was dangerous business. So we thank them for facing the dangers to continue to try to help our ancestors get free, right? And in order to conceal his identity. The lawyer Jay Bigelow, at one point, he began to write to William Steele under a different name. And not only did he begin to write to William Steele under a different name, he also began to write his letters in a way in which certain aspects of it what was hidden or encrypted, so that if they got intercepted, no one would really know exactly what they were talking about. And I think that's important to highlight here, because once you realize that the individuals who were working to get our ancestors free and who was working to get ancestor Ann Weems free, when you see that they had to specifically take extra steps to conceal their identity and intentions, you kind of get a glimpse of the dangers of the work that they were doing. But even in the midst of the dangers of the work that they were doing, they continued to do the work. And that's why I say that they were like superheroes, very, very honorable men and women. If you see on the left, the top paragraph says, "Will you recollect hereafter that in any of my future letters in which I may use brackets, whatever words may be within the brackets are intended to have no significance whatever to you, only to blind the eyes of the uninitiated. You will find an example at the close of my letter." And so he basically gives William Steele a code. He says that he will begin putting things in brackets in his letters. Now, the things in the brackets have no significance to William Steele whatsoever, but he puts them in there so that if his letter gets intercepted, the person reading it will think what's in the brackets is of importance, but that will only be used to confuse them about what the letter is actually talking about. And so we can see an example of this if we look at the bottom of the page on the left, where it says Washington, D.C., October 6th, 1855. He says, "Mr. Steele, dear sir, I regret exceedingly to learn by your favor of 4th instance that all things are not ready. Although I cannot speak of any immediate and positive danger." Then in brackets, we see, "Yet it is well known that the city is full of incendiaries." So he wants anybody that intercepts the letter to think that he's talking about that the city is full of incendiaries, as opposed to what he's really talking about. He's basically saying that, again, their plans to free ancestor Ann Weems have fallen short. Everything is not ready, meaning they had to have several key people in place, and everybody had to be ready to play their part in order to get this young girl free. He goes on to say, "Perhaps you are aware that any colored citizen is liable at any hour of day or night, without any show of authority, to have his house ransacked by constables, and if others do it and commit the most outrageous depredations, none but white witnesses can convict them. Such outrages are always common here, and no kind of property exposed to colored protection only can be considered safe. I don't say that much liberty should not be given to constables on account of numerous runaways, but it don't always work for good." Now, what he's basically saying is, at this time they had released something that was called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and since the Vigilance Committee and the Underground Railroad was doing such a good job at helping slaves escape to freedom, the powers that be had to enact legislation to make it harder for an individual to get free. And so what they did with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they made it legal for so-called slave catchers to go to what we know as free states, and basically anywhere around the country that they wanted, and interrogate people that they thought were harboring escaped slaves and bring them back down south to their owners. And so what he's saying is that you have multiple constables and others who are raiding colored people houses without any sort of authority, no warrants basically, and they are searching their houses looking for runaways, trying to bring them back. And now this caused a very big problem because not only were they trying to find runaways and finding them and taking them back to being enslaved, but in some instances they were capturing free people, legitimately free Negroes, and carrying them down south and selling them off into slavery, like that book that became a movie, 12 Years a Slave. That individual was free, and he was just captured and sold off into slavery. And so you can see how the situation was very, very dangerous for anyone who was involved in trying to help slaves get free. If you were a colored person, a Negro person, and if you were a white person. If you were a white person that was caught trying to help slaves escape, you were punished to the full extent of the law. Right? Yeah, you were definitely punished to the full extent of the law. But look, check this out. We have another letter here from the lawyer Bigelow to William Steele that was written October 12th, 1855. Now, when this letter was written, against all odds, they had acquired Anne Weems, right? They had acquired Anne Weems, but they had not yet transported her to William Steele, the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia, right? Remember, she arrived Thanksgiving Day, 1855. So this is October 1855. So we're going to try to get us a glimpse into what was happening between the time she actually escaped from the Negro slave trader to the time she showed up at the home, the office space of ancestor William Steele. So the lawyer writes and says, Mr. W.M. Steele, as you pick up all the news that is stirring, I contribute a few scraps to your stock, going to show that the poor slaveholders have their troubles as well as other people. 4 heavy losses on one small scrap cut from a single number of the Sun. And basically what he's talking about is the Sun is a newspaper. And when he's talking about small scraps cut from the newspaper, whenever there was a runaway, like you see on the screen, not whenever, but a lot of times they would run advertisements offering a reward for someone to capture the runaway slave. And so he's saying that there's 4 different runaway advertisements that he's sending to William Steele, and a lot of this is encoded as well. Like if you look on the right, you see at the bottom where it says September 29th, and then he's writing October 12th. This article that you see on your screen is one of the articles that the lawyer is talking to William Steele about. This is actually the one. So he goes on to say, how vexatious, how provoking. On the other hand, think of the poor, timid, breathless, flying child of 15. Now that's Anna Weems. $500 reward. Oh, for succor. To whom in all this wide land of freedom shall she flee and find safety? Alas, alas, the law points to no one. Is she still running with bleeding feet? Or hides she in some cold cave to rest and starve? $500 reward. Yours for the weak and the poor. Perish the reward. J.B. So you see, when J. Bigelow, the lawyer, wrote to William Steele, he mentions the $500 reward for the 15-year-old girl. The 15-year-old girl is Anne Weems. Now, this is the same girl that he has been writing back and forth about, okay, trying to get her free. And what's interesting about this is you see how he says, "Is she still running with bleeding feet? Or hides she in some cold cave to rest and starve? $500 reward." Now, when he says this, that's only for someone who intercepts his letter. Because when he wrote this letter, Ann Weems was living with him. Imagine that. She was actually living with him. But in order to throw anyone off the scent, he had to make it seem like he was questioning, oh, where can this runaway be? Amazing. Is she still running with bleeding feet? Is she hiding out in some cave somewhere? All along, Ann Weems is with him. He's worked tirelessly for 2 years to try to get her freedom. And so now he has acquired her. And so he's writing in code to William Steele, but he can't blatantly say, I have possession of her. But he can say, look, the young lady that we've been talking about, she's finally run away, right? There's a $500 reward for her. But all along, she's with him the entire time. But nobody at that time would have known that. And so look at the reward, the advertisement that they actually put out in the paper. $500 reward. Ran away on Sunday night, the 23rd, instant, before 12 o'clock from the subscriber residing in Rockville, Montgomery County, Maryland. My Negro girl, Anne Marie Weems, about 15 years of age, a bright mulatto, some small freckles on her face, slender person, thick suit of hair, inclined to be sandy. Her parents are free and reside in Washington, D.C. It is evident she was taken away by someone in a carriage, probably a white man, by whom she may be carried beyond the limits of the state of Maryland. I will give the above reward for her apprehension and detention so that I get her again. Charles M. Price, the Negro slave trader. Now get this. You see how he says, it is evident she was taken away by someone in a carriage, probably a white man, by whom she may be carried beyond the limits of the state of Maryland. Now that is what actually happened. The white man is the lawyer, Jay Bigelow, and he actually did carry her away in a carriage. Now, I don't know how he figured that out, but he actually put it in, maybe just assumed it. I'm not 100% sure, but that's actually what happened. That's actually how the lawyer got her to freedom. And so when they tell the story, what actually happened was she was able to make her escape, right? She was able to make her escape by dressing up like a boy. And she used the alias of Joe. And so what the lawyer did, instead of picking her up in front of his office, she escaped and made it to the White House. And so he picked her up in front of the White House and had her drive his carriage like the carriage driver. And the Jay Bigelow, the doctor, lawyer, he rode in the carriage. And so they just, they made it from the White House, and they basically traveled out of state. And so what happened was he was trying to transfer her from their starting point, their starting location, all the way to Philadelphia to William Steele himself, so that William Steele could reunite her with her family, who had already acquired their freedom and was living free in quote unquote British North America or Canada. But what happened was things were so hot when she first escaped that she had to live with Jay Bigelow for around like 6 weeks. That's why you see she ran away in September. She's with the doctor in October when he's writing to William Steele, pretending like he don't know where she's at. But she doesn't show up to William Steele's house until Thanksgiving Day, because all of that time she lived like a boy, and she lived with Jay Bigelow, the white man who was part of the Vigilance Committee, because they had to wait for things to kind of, die down. You know how it is. Sometimes it was too hot. It was too hot on the streets for them to have her escape from the Negro slave trader and then travel with her. They had to wait for things to die down a little bit. And so you see in the Underground Railroad records, he not only describes how Ann Weems lived as a boy with him for several weeks, but then when they were actually traveling from his home to Philadelphia, they stopped off at the at a farm, right? At a farm of some friends of Jay Bigelow, and these friends were actually slave traders as well, and they owned the farm and they had slaves on the farm, and so even while they were there, nobody realized that she was the escapee, because again they were looking for a female, and she really looked the part of a male, and they even stayed the night with a slaveholding family, and the rules held up. And then the next day they continued on their journey, and they made it all the way to William Steele's house. And we see that she arrived on Thanksgiving Day, November 1855, from the clutches of Charles M. Price, a Negro slave trader. So what we see again, that from the very beginning of the slave trade in Africa, before Europeans even showed up, you had Africans enslaving Africans, right? You had Africans enslaving Africans in Africa. And so when the transatlantic slave trade began and when Europeans got involved, you had what was known as the Negro slave catcher. And so what the Negro slave catcher would do, they would go into various tribes in West Africa. They would go to various tribes in Central Africa, and they would capture individuals. They would kidnap children, and then they would carry them from their tribe, from their homeland, to the coast of West Africa. On the coast of West Africa, they had several forts, several castles, several trading ports, where they would chain them up, hold them hostage, hold them prisoners, and wait for a slave trading vessel to show up from a European nation or from the Americas. And then these African slave catchers, they would sell our African ancestors to the Europeans or to the Americans, and then they would bring our ancestors over to the Americas to be enslaved. I showed you guys accounts of individuals who were enslaved here. Their parents and grandparents testified to being caught just like that. I showed you Oluwadu Equiano, who was captured. Him and his sister was captured just like that. And once here, you had Negroes who worked as overseers for the slave owner, who beat and issued out punishments to their fellow enslaved Negroes, African American. Not only did you have the Negro overseers and the Negro traders, you also had Negro slave owners who bought and sold a lot of our ancestors right here in these American shores. They did everything that the white people did. They even tried to put advertisements in the newspapers offering to buy more, so they could buy more and sell more and enrich themselves. And some of our ancestors, they were escaped on the Underground Railroad from these African slave traders and African slave owners. So although this is something that we don't really talk about too often, I wanted to just put this video out there to just put some of this information out there so that individuals could go over it, digest it, and really think about the reality on the ground. So what you have is blood on African hands. You have African slave catchers and African slave traders right here in America. And as sad as it may sound, the slave trade would not have happened had it not been for the African slave catchers, right? And it wouldn't have went how it went in America if it wasn't for the African overseer, the Negro overseers, and you also had Negro slave traders, Negro slave owners who dealt in the flesh of our ancestors. So as always, I hope you guys heard something that you never heard before. Again, if you haven't already, hit the like button, right? Hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that little notification bell so that you can be notified whenever I go live, so that you can be alerted whenever I drop a new video. And again, if you like the information, if you learn anything, or if you like to learn, you can always support the channel with Cash App $ The Real Bookworm. Now, if you can't, there's no real big deal. I just appreciate you guys tapping in. But if you want to support the channel, if you want to support literacy, if you want to support, just go ahead and drop something in the bucket, man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. As always, this your brother Matthew Daniels, the writer, the scribe, the author, and the bookworm, family. But I'm not just a bookworm world. I am the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, may your name live on forever, and may your memory, family, never die. And let's make intelligence, let's make intelligence great again. The ancestors speak. I'm out, family.